The click of the camera shutter echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet yard. I lowered the lens, staring at the screen where the image of the old oak tree filled the frame. Its gnarled branches stretched toward the sky, stark and bare, yet rooted so deeply it seemed eternal. A perfect metaphor for how I felt, sturdy on the outside, but hollow within. Still chasing that perfect shot? Mark's voice broke my focus. He stood at the doorway, tie slightly askew, holding a folder brimming with papers. He looked at the camera in my hands, his expression neither dismissive nor impressed, just indifferent. "It's not about perfection," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "It's about capturing something real." "Hmm," he muttered, flipping through his notes. "Well, you're good at it." The words were meant to be a compliment, but they landed flat, devoid of warmth or sincerity. He glanced at his watch and frowned. "I've got a big presentation today. Late dinner again?" Of course. Another dinner where I'd sit alone, eating cold leftovers while he worked late. I forced a smile. "Good luck with the presentation." He nodded, already halfway out the door. As the sound of his car faded into the distance, the house seemed to exhale, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I turned back to the tree. Its silhouette against the morning light was striking, but something about it felt incomplete. I stepped back, searching for a new angle, when a voice startled me. "It's a beauty, isn't it?" I spun around to see George standing at the edge of the garden, a watering can in his hand. His presence was as familiar as the tree itself. He had been spending more time here since Mark's mother passed. At first, his visits felt like an obligation, a way to fill the silence of his empty home. But lately, they'd become something more natural, almost comforting. "It's stubborn," I said, gesturing toward the tree. "No matter how harsh the winter, it survives." George chuckled, his voice warm and rich, like aged whiskey. "Resilience is underrated these days." He set the watering can down and walked closer, his gaze shifting from the tree to me. "I've seen some of your photos. You have an eye for beauty." "Thanks," I said, surprised by the genuine tone of his compliment. It was a stark contrast to Mark's earlier indifference. "It's just a hobby." "It's more than that," he said, his voice steady. "You capture things most people overlook." His words lingered in the air, filling a void I didn't know existed. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen, not as someone's wife or daughter-in-law, but as a person with her own passions. We spent the next hour tending to the garden. George told me stories about the house when Mark was a boy, his voice tinged with nostalgia. He spoke of his late wife with a tenderness that made my chest ache. As he described her laugh, her love for roses, and her ability to find joy in the smallest moments, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Mark had spoken about me with such affection. "Thank you for helping out," I said as George stood to leave. "It means a lot." He smiled, his eyes soft but searching. "You're easy to help, Julia. You remind me of her. Strong, but with so much more beneath the surface." As he walked away, I turned back to the oak tree, framing it again through my lens. This time, the picture felt different, fuller. And for a fleeting moment, so did I. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I sat on the terrace, scrolling through the photos on my camera. The light from the setting sun bathed the yard in hues of orange and pink, and the old oak tree stood tall and shadowed, its branches etched against the fading sky. "You have a way of capturing the world that most people miss." I turned to see George standing by the doorway, a glass of wine in his hand. His presence was both familiar and grounding, and I gestured for him to join me. He lowered himself into the chair across from mine, the lines on his face softening in the golden light. "Let me see," he said, gesturing toward my camera. I hesitated for a moment before handing it to him. Watching his expression as he scrolled through my photos was oddly satisfying, his brows furrowed in concentration, and the faintest smile tugged at his lips. "These are incredible," he said finally. "They're not just photos. They're glimpses of you." I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze. "You're too kind. They're just snapshots." He shook his head. "No, they're more than that. Look at this one." He held up a photo of the oak tree, taken from an angle that framed the gnarled bark against the vibrant sky. "It's strong and unyielding, but there's a softness to how you've captured it. It says more about you than you realize." His words settled over me like a blanket, wrapping me in a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "I guess I never thought of it that way," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. George leaned back, still holding the camera. "You remind me of her, you know. My wife. She had this way of finding beauty in the ordinary. She saw things others didn't." I looked down, unsure how to respond. The weight of his words was both comforting and disarming. "Do you miss her?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. "Every day," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But life goes on, doesn't it? We find new ways to fill the spaces they leave behind." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. He handed the camera back to me, and as I took it, our fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, like a spark catching dry kindling. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw something there I hadn't expected, something that mirrored my own feelings. "Julia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mean to overstep, but you deserve to be seen." My breath caught in my throat. For the first time in years, I felt truly noticed, not for what I did, but for who I was. The vulnerability in his gaze was both terrifying and exhilarating. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, tentative at first, then deepening as the world around us faded. It was a kiss that wasn't planned, wasn't rational, but felt inevitable. When we pulled away, the weight of what had just happened hung between us. I searched his face for regret, but found only understanding. "I should go," he said after a moment, his voice thick with emotion. He stood, pausing as if to say something more, then walked back toward the house. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the oak tree. The camera rested in my lap, its lens still pointed toward the remnants of the sunset. But for the first time, I didn't need a photograph to capture the moment. It was etched in my mind, vivid and unshakable. The days after that evening on the terrace blurred into a restless haze. My camera became my refuge, a constant companion as I wandered the house and garden, searching for anything to capture. The textures of peeling paint on the fence, the way sunlight danced through the cracks in the curtains, each image felt like an anchor to something real in the midst of the chaos inside me. But I knew the truth. The camera wasn't the only reason I spent so much time outside. My hands trembled with anticipation each time I stepped into the garden, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. George. He wasn't always there, but when he was, the moments we shared felt charged, as if the air between us held a secret only we could understand. He would pass by the kitchen window while I made coffee, his glance lingering just a second too long. Or he'd pause in the yard, pretending to adjust a sprinkler, but I'd catch the faint smile he tried to hide. "Got any new masterpieces to show me?" he asked one morning, leaning casually against the porch railing. His voice carried that familiar warmth, a subtle magnetism that drew me in. I hesitated, holding up the camera. "Maybe, but I'm not sure they're worth sharing." He chuckled, the sound low and rich. "You underestimate yourself, Julia. Show me." I handed him the camera, our fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. He flipped through the photos, pausing at one of the oak tree, framed against the early morning mist. "This one," he said, tapping the screen. "It's like you've captured its soul." I smiled, feeling both seen and exposed. "It's just a tree." "It's never just a tree," he replied, his eyes meeting mine. There was an unspoken connection in that look, a quiet acknowledgement of the line we'd already crossed. Inside the house, things felt eerily normal. Mark was as busy as ever, buried in deadlines and conference calls. He barely noticed the hours I spent outside with my camera, or the moments I lingered too long at the window, watching George move through the yard. One evening, Mark came home with a carefully wrapped box in his hands. He placed it on the table with a rare smile. "What's this?" I asked, taken aback by his uncharacteristic gesture. "Open it," he said, nudging it toward me. I peeled back the paper to reveal a new camera lens. It was sleek and expensive, the kind of thing I'd mentioned wanting months ago, but had long since forgotten. "For your photography," Mark said, his tone almost apologetic. "I know I haven't been around much lately. I thought this might help." The weight of the gift settled heavily in my hands. I looked at Mark, his face a mixture of hope and guilt, and felt a pang of regret. He was trying in his own way, but it felt like he was reaching across a chasm that had grown too wide. "Thank you," I said softly, forcing a smile. "It's perfect." But as I hugged him, the image of George lingered in my mind, unshakable. The guilt twisted in my chest, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the pull I felt toward him. Later that night, I stood by the window, the new lens in hand. I focused it on the oak tree, its silhouette dark against the moonlit sky. But as I adjusted the focus, my eyes drifted to George's house in the distance. A single light glowed in the window, a beacon that both called to me and warned me away. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. The tension between what I wanted and what I had was becoming unbearable, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep walking this tightrope. The warmth of the shower poured over me, filling the small bathroom with dense steam. I closed my eyes, letting the water run down my shoulders and back, trying to escape the thoughts that had taken root in my mind. My fingers trailed absently along the bottle of body cream on the shelf, and before I knew it, I'd scooped some into my palm, spreading it along my arms. The floral scent filled the air, grounding me as I focused on the sensation of my skin softening beneath my touch. It was almost meditative, the circular motions, the coolness of the cream against the heat of the shower. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget everything: Mark's indifference, George's gaze that lingered too long, and the pull I felt every time I saw him. This was my sanctuary, the only place where the chaos of my mind quieted, even if just for a little while. The creak of the door jarred me from my thoughts. My heart leapt to my throat as I instinctively covered myself, my movements halting. The steam had fogged the glass, but I could make out the shape of someone standing there. "Julia?" His voice was deep and familiar. "George." There was hesitation in his tone, as if he wasn't sure whether to stay or retreat. "George." My voice came out strained, caught between surprise and something else I couldn't name. "What are you—" I didn't realize. His words trailed off, and for a moment, it seemed like he would leave. But instead, he stayed, his silhouette motionless in the doorway. I I didn't mean to interrupt." I glanced down, realizing the cream still coated my hands, glistening in the light. The intimacy of the moment struck me, not just because of where we were, but because of what it represented. Here I was, exposed in more ways than one, and he had walked into the middle of it. "You shouldn't be here," I managed, though the words lacked conviction. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears as the tension thickened. "I know," he said softly, stepping closer. The steam seemed to part as he moved, the outline of his figure becoming sharper. "I just—" He paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "I didn't know you were in here." The logical thing would have been to turn away, to tell him to leave. But something in his gaze rooted me in place. His expression wasn't predatory or dismissive. It was curious, maybe even reverent. And instead of pulling away, I stayed where I was. "You should go," I said, my voice faltering. I should, he replied, but he didn't move. His eyes lingered, catching on the faint traces of cream along my arm, the way my hand hovered, half raised. The air between us felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that demanded a release. He stepped closer, and my breath caught. His hand brushed mine, barely a touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The cream on my hands smeared slightly against his, and for a fleeting moment, we both looked down at the small mess we'd created, as if it were a symbol of something far larger. Julia, he murmured, his voice thick with something I couldn't name. I turned to face him fully, the water still streaming over my shoulders. My gaze met his, and in that instant, every wall I had built came crumbling down. His hand reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from my face, and the gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that it left me breathless. I didn't think. There was no room for thought. I leaned in, and so did he. Our lips met, the kiss starting tentative but quickly deepening into something more. The warmth of his mouth against mine, the roughness of his hand on my cheek, it was overwhelming, consuming. When we finally pulled away, the reality of what had just happened settled over us like the steam in the room. He looked at me, his hand still lingering on my face, as if he didn't want to let go. This shouldn't have happened, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my heart screamed otherwise. I know. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but instead, he stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. The door opened and closed softly behind him, leaving me alone with the sound of water and the storm of emotions raging within me. As I turned off the shower, my fingers brushed against the bottle of cream again, its scent still clinging to the air. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same anymore. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting warm patterns across the living room floor. I sat on the edge of the couch, my camera resting in my lap, but for once, it didn't offer the solace I sought. My mind was elsewhere, on him. George had become a constant presence in my thoughts, his words and touch lingering like the faint scent of the cream I had used that morning in the shower. But as much as I longed for his attention, another part of me ached for the life I had built with Mark. A life that felt more like a faded photograph now, its edges fraying, its colors dimmed. Julia! I jumped at the sound of Mark's voice, his presence startling me out of my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, holding a stack of papers and a weary smile. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I shook my head, forcing a smile. It's fine, just lost in thought. He set the papers down on the table and walked over, his gaze scanning my face. You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything okay? The concern in his voice was genuine, but it felt misplaced. Too little, too late. Just tired, I said, brushing off his question. Nothing to worry about. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. I know I've been busy with work, and I haven't exactly been the best husband lately. Maybe we could spend the evening together. Dinner, just the two of us. The suggestion caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with, the one who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who used to hold me close as if I were the most precious thing in his world. Okay, I said softly, the word feeling both like a promise and a betrayal. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate chain around my neck. I had chosen a simple dress, something Mark had complimented long ago. It felt strange now, wearing it for him, knowing that my heart was no longer wholly his. As we sat down to dinner, Mark seemed lighter, his usual tension replaced by a rare ease. He poured me a glass of wine and started talking about his day, about a big project that had finally come together. I nodded in the right places, smiled when it felt appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere, across the yard, in another house, with another man. Julia! Mark's voice pulled me back to the present. You're awfully quiet tonight. Sorry, I said, forcing another smile. just enjoying the moment. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm but unfamiliar. I've missed this. Missed you. The words should have made my heart swell, but instead, they filled me with a gnawing guilt. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had been by my side for years. The man who had built a life with me, who still cared, even if he didn't always show it. I've missed you too, I lied, squeezing his hand. But even as I said the words, my thoughts betrayed me. I couldn't stop picturing George, the way his gaze lingered, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine. Later that night, as Mark drifted off to sleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I wanted to believe that I could fix things, that I could salvage what was left of my marriage. But the truth was far more complicated. My heart was split in two, each side pulling me in a different direction. One path led to safety, to the life I had always known. The other was unpredictable, dangerous, but it felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I turned to face the sleeping figure beside me, a pang of guilt twisted in my chest. Mark had tried tonight, really tried, and for a fleeting moment, I wanted to try too. But as I closed my eyes, George's face filled my mind, his voice whispering words I couldn't ignore. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, but its warmth did little to thaw the chill that had settled in the house. I was in the kitchen, sipping my coffee and staring blankly at the counter, when I heard Mark's voice from the other room. "Julia!" he called, his tone sharp and unfamiliar. My chest tightened as I set the mug down and walked toward him. He stood in the living room, holding my camera. The screen was on, and I could see the photo he'd stopped at. A shot of George, leaning casually against the oak tree. It wasn't just a portrait. The way the light framed his face, the softness of his expression, the angle. It was intimate, undeniably so. "What's this?" Mark asked, his eyes narrowing. His tone wasn't accusatory yet, but I could hear the edge of suspicion creeping in. "It's just a photo," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Just a photo?" He held the camera up, shaking it slightly. "This doesn't look like just a photo, Julia. What's going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My mind raced for an explanation, but the truth loomed over me, heavy and unyielding. Instead of answering, I turned away, retreating into the kitchen. "Julia!" His voice followed me, louder this time. "Don't walk away from me. I need an answer." But I couldn't face him. Not now. Not with the weight of everything that had happened threatening to crush me. "It's nothing," I said weakly, my back to him. "You're overthinking it." Mark didn't press further, but the tension in the air was palpable. I felt his gaze burning into me before he finally stormed out, the front door slamming shut behind him. That evening, I was in the garden, trying to find solace in the familiar act of photographing the fading sunlight. The click of the shutter was a small comfort, but it did little to ease the storm raging inside me. I heard voices drifting from the house, low and tense. My heart sank as I realized it was Mark and George. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as I crept closer, their conversation grew louder, more heated. "You've always been like this." Mark's voice was sharp, laced with anger. "Always trying to outshine me, even when it comes to my wife." "Mark, that's not what this is," George replied, his tone calm but firm. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you." "Don't patronize me," Mark snapped. "I'm not blind, Dad. I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. "I never meant for this to happen," George said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "But maybe if you'd paid more attention to her, she wouldn't have felt so alone." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of George's words pressing down on all of us. "You have no right," Mark said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. no right to interfere in my marriage. I couldn't listen anymore. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back toward the house. I needed to stop this, to say something, but when I reached the doorway, the two of them turned to look at me, their faces etched with betrayal and pain. Julia, Mark said, his voice cracking, tell me it's not true. Tears welled in my eyes as I stood there, torn between the man I had built my life with and the man who had made me feel alive again. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too heavy, too complicated to unravel in a single moment. Later that night, I stood in the garden, the camera dangling from my hand. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. Mark had retreated to the bedroom, the door closed firmly behind him. George had left without a word. I stared at the oak tree, its branches reaching toward the stars, like silent witnesses to everything that had unfolded. The camera felt heavier than ever, its weight a reminder of the choices I had made and the ones still ahead of me. I raised the lens and framed the tree, the familiar act grounding me. But as I pressed the shutter, I realized this photo wouldn't capture what I was feeling. Nothing could. For now, all I could do was stand here, suspended between two lives. Two men, two versions of myself. The future was a blank canvas, and I wasn't ready to pick up the brush.